have lots of paper here, so I can ask you all these questions. Can I cheat on my own paper? Okay. All right, so let's start this. Marko, I'm going to go with you because we met each other. And you just always giving me a hard time on these panels. He was telling me all the mess-ups I've made today, guys. Keeping track of me, which is good. When we look at embedded finance, we just heard this entire conversation around SMEs and around everybody wanting to build their own ecosystem and having everybody and their mother be their partner. What is the risk of that? I think we've seen in the marketplace. What has been your experience, Marko, with Doc Financial?
Well, what we see is, especially in the payment space, many were trying to build their own ecosystem, thinking their brand is so strong that the customer would take a payment solution from them as well, in addition to the core product. And what we could see is many have failed, even very, very large brands. And that's what I see as a risk, that they go on an endeavor trying to, thinking that they, by their brand, can take this market by storm, which seldomly happens. And that's why I think it is important that you, when you are in the B2B space, that you really understand and that you tell your customers as well what to do and what not to do, because there's a lot of risks involved with that. And again, these endeavors, they usually do not come very, very cheaply.
Kim, what has been your experience both at Aion and Vodeno in this time of like a high economic crisis? We're talking about inflation. We're still dealing with the war. What has that been like for you, and what have you seen?
We clearly see two trends. On the one hand, from the consumer perspective, it all started in the pandemic. We saw acceleration, and we discussed before as well. Consumers clearly went to mobile first, demanding from a digital perspective, full frictionless checkout processes and so on. So these days it's common, and everyone knows if you want to offer a good experience to the consumer, it needs to be top-notch digital technology. And brands have really understood, smart brands have understood, to be able to grow their core business by leaning into that trend and to enlarge and enrich their experience and their checkout process by embedding financial services, to make it more valuable for their customers, to make it more at the moment of truth to offer those financial services. And you rightfully raised, so this has even pivoted and shifted even more in times of inflation, because to give you an example, a consumer is maybe low on budget, right? So a normal loyalty card where he earns points, maybe in times of inflation, it's not what worries him at night. So if he could instead get from his retailer the same card, but that would give him value, or maybe the opportunity to pay for his shopping a bit later in 3 installments or even 2 months later, that's the added value offered, and that's the exciting thing of banking as service, leaning into the needs of those consumers in times of economical crisis and inflation to really adopt that behavior that fulfills the needs that they are having right at that moment. So.
Dr. Piotr, being in regulatory and compliance and in this market, that is no small feat. Adding different providers and understanding, how do you explain to the regulators or to the end consumer which part is your service, which part is somebody else's service? What has been your experience?
Quite complex, to be honest. But first of all, the starting point, the lawyers tend to be verbose. So I promise strongly to keep to my notes, not losing myself in
I'll make sure that.
In
Don't
details. Yes. So and generally, I think that, in my view, the topic of our discussion is quite provocative. I do not see the significant impact of inflation on the BaaS model generally, but of course I see an avalanche of new regulations and the inflation of new regulations. So perhaps the word inflation in the title refers not the money, but legal aspects and legal provisions. That's the first point. The second point I would like to raise is connected with realistic regulatory compliance. What I'm thinking by that. Realistic compliance with regulatory criteria, that is something not only we should observe during the process of licensing the bank, but also throughout the services life, through the whole period of we try to deliver the services. This is not a world where we build a wonderful house and then call it a day, simply. And I think that the banking business sees continuous regulatory changes, and in multi-entity character of BaaS model only multiplies that challenges. And if you allow me, the third at that moment comment, which is also, from my point of view, fundamental. The bank is always to blame. Exaggeration or truth? Of course, from the regulatory compliance perspective. So, licensed banks are responsible for ensuring that the BaaS partnership complies with all regulation relevant which is required. Failure to comply with regulation can result in fines, legal actions, and mainly the damage to the bank's reputation. And I think that the reputation, that's something absolutely fundamental and crucial. We could ask ourselves, what's the bank's most valuable assets? Client base, funds, employees, and know-how, or their reputation. And I argue that the bank's reputation comes first, and the events of the last few weeks in the United States and the banking system there only strengthen that element and make me more convinced. So if the bank's reputation is destroyed, probably the process of losing consumers and funds, it's inevitable, and the bankruptcy, the worst case scenario, is a matter of the mere minutes. Why I'm talking about that? Because in the BaaS model, I think that the bank puts its reputation at stake. Maybe I'm exaggerating.
I don't think you're exaggerating. I think we've seen, like, through the corporate model, not only this happen. I think, well, if we want to talk Silicon Valley Bank or FTX, I'll need a whole other panel for that. But when you think about it, Marko, you've seen that evolution from Solaris to Doc to what you're doing right now. What are your perspectives in terms of how do you fast innovate, and where does liability start and end? You're providing this to a lot of other clients.
Let me start with what Piotr said. In general, I do agree with the inflation of the regulation, which I think is to a certain extent crazy. Whilst regulation is absolutely needed, we have seen it, but the point is the following: the reaction of the regulator is very often, like what we see now, is that we are not regulated enough. So they're taking the wrong conclusion out of that, because what happened in the US has nothing to do with regulation.
And it has nothing to do with technology innovation either. We're talking about capital reserves and completely other KYC things.
Now, I happen to have founded two companies, which Solaris and Doc, which are both regulated. So that means that we have taken the whole, or we have gone the full Monty of getting the full banking license or an EMI license, as in the case of Doc, and yes, we put ourselves out there. But exactly for that, well, one learns in a course of a life. For Doc, what we do not do is we do not take fintech customers. So it's not the fintech enablement anymore what we are focusing on. We are looking more at embedding, and that's what Kim just said, making the experience of these companies better by embedding real services in it. We are active in the insurance industry, in the assistance industry, mobility, etc. Because what Piotr said is exactly right, because you had fintechs out there. Well, I'm an older person, and you see all these youngsters, they didn't care about regulation. And you could see this now with Revolut and others just being hand-slapped. right? They got a slap on their wrists for not being compliant enough. And that's why I think is you have to find a middle ground there and to understand what is really the service you give out, what is the risk there for the consumer, for the businesses, for your customers, and make sure that everyone plays on a level field. In Germany, always when I'm talking, you have the Sparkassen and the Volksbank, they said, you guys from the fintech sector, you're not regulated. Bullshit. Of course we are.
Of course.
But sometimes you don't have to go as far. And Piotr is a lawyer, right? He is from a legal side, and obviously he's. So you don't have to. But it's very often
we need to balance
with larger banks. What you have is you're overly conscious because you know of the repercussions, and the bigger the company gets, Santander is not a small one. So the bigger the company gets, you have internal pressure as well, not just from a regulator.
Kim?
Yeah, I see it a bit differently. I'm not a lawyer, but I don't see legal and regulation as a threat, rather as offering peace of mind, because a consumer using financial services from a business, whether it's the end user, a business itself, or another consumer, he or he just counts on the fact that it works, that it's risk-fully proved, that it's compliant with compliance rules, but also with legal regulations and so on. So as a bank, because we hold a bank license and we offer it to others that are unlicensed, or to other banks that do have it but look for other needs, the consumer simply relies on the fact that we make it work. We are under supervision of the regulator. We kind of promise to the market to be compliant, to watch after the money, to take care that nothing is lost. Yeah, we do. We do. So, and that's offering the peace of mind. So for us, it's not a threat. It's rather a veil, so to speak, on which we can surf, in order to kind of skip or segment the good ones from the bad ones. Because if you're not compliant, automatically the providers that are not, they will be filtered out. So it's survival of the fittest in the market by doing so.
I admire.
Sorry,
I admire that approach, yeah. May I?
You admire the approach?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Do you have changes to that approach? Because when I think about inflation in times of crisis, what also comes to mind for me is you now are taking the burden. So what is your burden on doing the KYC or the understanding of how far should a BaaS provider really offer an industry financial services? Because now we're talking about real-time payments, we're talking about real-time funds, and the consequences of this being effectively in your reputation.
Let me, Piotr, I know you wanted to say something there. I saw you, but let me jump in there, because the KYC and the whole regulation and transaction monitoring, etc. And again, I fully agree with you. We need the regulation in order to make sure that the customer funds, that the businesses are safe. However, we as banks, e-money institutions, or what have you, we are not an institution of the state who has to go after basically the criminals. We have to make everything in our power to support that, to put boundaries there. But sometimes, from a regulation perspective, we are seen as an extension of the criminal justice system,
of course.
And that's what we are not. And this, I think, this has to be very, very clear, and it has to be made clear to the regulator as well. There's a certain leverage we can have, but not more.
I think we don't need more regulation. We need the wisdom transcribed within the provision of law. But coming back to the AML, anti-money laundering, from the point of view of BaaS model of cooperation, let's try to imagine the scale of anti-money laundering challenges from the perspective of hypothetical case of transferring the model in reality created by the Green Dot Corporation and Uber and to the Polish market. So imagine that we transfer that experiment to the Polish market and the Polish legal environment. The very strict and increasing requirements in terms of KYC, knowing your client policies, seem, in my opinion, probably almost impossible to follow without establishing something like the AML high school, college, and to provide the higher education in banking for Uber driver, so that they can meet these requirements. Financial security measures, sometimes called the customer due diligence, and reporting obligations on the suspicious transaction. Please keep in mind that it is regardless of the value of the transaction. In this operation model, a challenge comparable to space expedition mission or something like this. Of course,
that's a good reference. Like space expedition, I would probably describe the digital identity infrastructure of Europe as a space expedition.
And only another one example, if you
I will allow you.
and I will keep silent at least for 2 or 3 minutes. I would like to point out that many regulations expected in terms of that model are also so challenging because let me say something or describe the outsourcing model in Poland. And let's not forget about the bans on cascade, multi-level outsourcing in Poland. Imagine how to create effective, vivid BaaS system and also to respect the rules. Also, the rules concerning unlimited liability within the outsourcing. Also, on the side of non-bank part of that cooperation organization. It is almost impossible when we would like to generate a flourishing business in terms of BaaS.
You are generating a flourishing business in charge of revenue and growth for both entities. What's the challenge? Does it come with pressure on pricing margins? Does it come with pressure? Is that where you see sort of the consequence of some of this liability in conversation?
I would say the biggest challenge is to find the good balancing point between offering a great end-user UX, because if you are working with non-financial services, you buy clothes at Zalando, checkout process, everything is top, quick, at the finger point, and so on. Well,
the bar is really high.
If you exactly, if you work with financial services, there are things that you cannot skip. I mean, we are regulated. There are things you need to check, the identity, and so on, so on. So you simply cannot omit it. So by default, it's a bit more boring. It's a bit more less sexy, and so on. So to find the trading balance between top experience so that the end consumers use it, also the financial services, versus being compliant and doing what you have to do, I would say that's the biggest challenge, to find that equilibrium between both worlds, so to speak, UX and the banking.
How are you finding that balance, before I let Marko ask you a question?
Me, myself?
Oh, well, Vodeno.
Our company. By working in multidisciplinary teams, we have strong legal and compliance teams, risk teams on the one hand, and on the other hand, product owners and experts
people saying, come on, this has to be better.
And then good discussions internally to kind of balance it already prior to going to market with it.
Yeah, I think this is the strongest point for banking as a service. And again, I founded 2 of the banking as a service providers, and I wouldn't if I didn't believe in it. And what is one of the biggest...
Are you maybe just a little crazy and an entrepreneur that keeps doing the same thing?
The crazy part for sure. But anyway, what we had, which other companies which were already existing did not have, and that is the fresh start. So being greenfield, to use newest technologies, the newest, let's say, knowledge on everything, what is UX, what is UI, what the customers want. We come from a payment industry, so we have been before and really already seen what the customers expect. And there is the big difference between, let's say, the incumbents, traditional banks, and the BaaS players, because they say we keep the back shop clean, while at the same time we partner with companies who make sure that they get the best experience for the customers out there, be it in their own core products or being a new product on top of it. But I think that is what defines banking as a service, and I think that's where we are lucky of being born just 10 years ago, 3 years ago, something like that.
Yeah.
And to live in the same geography with only a handful of players, right?
Exactly. Instead of 7,500 banks, it's only 15 BaaS players in Europe. So
still a blue ocean.
There's
still a blue ocean.
There's still a lot to do.
There's still a lot to do.
You touch
We take another half an hour, so it's okay.
Yeah.
No, but because I need to get all these guys on time. But if you have a closing remark, by all means.
No.
Okay.
But it was absolutely at the point. Hit home, because we should also think about the organization culture integration when we are thinking about the BaaS model, not only about the legal regulation requirements and so on and so forth. And of course, there are a lot to do. And I can imagine that, for example, the private banking, from the perspective of BaaS, it's something to explore and to prepare that fantastic space mission I've mentioned before.
The space mission, I think, resonates one truth. Like, clearly this is not a game for beginners. Clearly regulation and legislation will come into effect, and hopefully we'll get to see actually BaaS transform industries. I think it'd be really interesting to build a world in Europe where the likes of Starbucks and others actually have to have a banking regulation. So with that, let's welcome and thank my lovely panel for their remarks and for their chat. I really appreciate it.